Welcome back to another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp, where my job is to help train Sabbath School teachers and front row students to get the most out of their class. Today we're going to be looking at lesson number 6 in the Adult Bible Study Guide, called The Hour of His Judgment. Now we've got a lot to talk about this week, so grab your Bibles and your study guide, because Sabbath School Boot Camp starts now. Alright, welcome back. We've been talking about the three angels' messages of Revelation 14 this quarter here in this guide. Today we're going to be talking specifically about the timing of the judgment described in the first angel's message. The lesson opens with a beautiful and disturbing story about how a forest fire began consuming Yellowstone National Park when a ranger found a bird literally burned to ashes. Now this ranger pushed the bird out of the way to find 3 baby birds who were hiding underneath their mother. She could have flown away, we're told, but she died protecting them from the fire. In the same way, the lesson tells us Christ took on the fires of the judgment for us. Now, I love that story, even if it's totally untrue. If you Google this story, one of the top hits will be Snopes, which traces the story back to a series of children's lessons published in 1945, one of which was about a hen and a prairie fire. And in the original, which of course takes place on a farm, not at Yellowstone, one little chick doesn't listen to his mother and dies in the fire. So yeah, you can always tell the original story if you want to traumatize your class. Now the little red hen was never written as if it were a true story. It was a parable that some Christian rewrote later on as if it was news and as if it was in National Geographic and as if it pertained to Yellowstone National Park, none of which is true. Look, the moral of the story is fine. I believe that Jesus took the judgment on our behalf, and I know that evangelists have a long tradition of telling stories of, shall we say, dubious provenance. But when you pass on a false story as if it's true, it undermines your credibility. I Googled this and found that it was false in about 25 seconds. It is, well, disturbing. I mean, it is so much to expect that the editors of the Adult Bible Study Guide might do the same. The Adult Bible Study. We're not editing now. Just treat this story like a parable. Remove the reference to National Geographic and say, a story was once told. Okay, don't sacrifice your credibility for such a small pot of stew. Now, the second thing I want to say is that in introducing this topic, you're going to be teaching the pre-Advent or investigative judgment this week. This is the one unique contribution Adventism has made to Christian theology. After all, other Christians keep the Sabbath or that they believe death is asleep, but only Adventists teach that Jesus entered the most holy place in 1844 and commenced with the investigative judgment. Now, I want to briefly make you aware of the history of this doctrine before you set about teaching it. If you've been around long enough, you know that there was a little bit of a controversy over some Adventist ministers publicly stating that they no longer think it was biblical in the late 1970s, early 1980s, culminating in the firing of a professor named Desmond Ford. There was more to this issue than the investigative judgment, to be sure, but it was arguably the most severe shock that the Seventh-day Adventist Church received in the 20th century. Nearly half of the pastors in Australia reportedly were fired or quit. And since then, as an Adventist physicist said best, Adventist ministers and administrators do not preach about this subject and will not voluntarily discuss it. The younger Adventist population knows little or nothing about the investigative judgment. By their collective lack of interest, the Adventist population has voted against it. Whew. Now, there is some truth to the fact that Adventist pastors and administrators do not proclaim this one unique doctrine which Seventh-day Adventists hold very prominently. Well, you Sabbath school teachers are now going to proclaim it. You're going to talk about it this week. So if you thought you could just wing it this week, show up Friday night, cram, and show up then at class the next day, well, I wouldn't. This is one you're going to want to study for. And I'll recommend some resources for you at the end of this video if you want some help, so stay tuned till then. Okay, let's outline how this week is going to go. This is a pretty standard study approach to the investigative judgment. On Sunday and Monday, we're going to be looking at Daniel 8:14, which introduces the 2300 days and the concept of cleansing the sanctuary. On Tuesday and Wednesday, we are turning to Daniel chapter 9, which adds on to the 2300-day prophecy and zeroes in on the first coming of Jesus. And on Thursday, we will talk about how the 2300-day prophecy terminates in 1844 CE and what this means for us. And as always, on Friday, I'll share some practical lessons we can learn from this and suggest those resources for further study if you want to go deeper. Last thing before we get to Sunday, let's talk about tactics for you teachers out there. First of all, if you're teaching, then you should have a good grasp of what's going on in Daniel 8 and 9. We are not covering the contents of those entire chapters in this video, and you're not going to cover them in class, but it is good to know what's happening because Daniel 8:14, well, there's 13 verses that come before it, and somebody may have a question about what's going on in this chapter and all of that. So you should probably know Daniel 8 and 9. Second, this is a tough subject. Just admit it to yourself. Adventists in your class may agree with what you're presenting, but most people don't see the point, I would say. What difference does 1844 make for me? So make it practical for people. Find ways to make it practical. I think you're going to find that as you go through Daniel 8:14 and then on to Daniel 9, people can just start getting glassy-eyed. And so you make sure that you land the plane this week. Make sure that you pull their head out of the clouds and say, this is why this subject matters, okay? The lesson is not going to do that for you. You're going to have to land the plane yourself. Now, the lesson, of course, cannot possibly explain all of Daniel 8 and 9 in just a few pages, so there are a ton of gaps and assumptions being made in this lesson, probably for the sake of time. Just be aware of them. Martin Weber identified 4 assumptions that you have to prove in order to make sense of this. First, that a day can equal a year in apocalyptic prophecy. Second, that Daniel 9 is meant to be the continuation of Daniel 8's vision. Third, that the 490 years are cut off from a longer time span of 2300 years. Fourth, that the starting date of the 2300 days is 457 BC. Now, the lesson will attempt to prove all 4 of these things, but do your own research if you aren't clear on it after reading the lesson. Now, this is an important point. Again, don't try and wing this one. To present it well and thoroughly can build confidence in people. If you present it in a sloppy way, you can undermine confidence. This is tough because we typically don't teach good Bible study in Adventist churches. We teach good Bible conclusions. And when people have to open a Bible and actually study it for themselves, it can be discouraging. Now, I'm not trying to be mean here. I think most Christians have this problem, but this is a prime opportunity to wean people off of their addiction to popular evangelists who supply them with the answers so they can avoid thinking for themselves. They say things like, oh, well, preacher so-and-so just explains it so much better than I ever could. I don't care. I'm thankful for our evangelists and preachers, but there's a time when you need to study for yourself so you can come up with your own conviction. I don't care what the other preachers say. I don't care what Ellen White says, because other Christians say that we base this doctrine on Ellen White and not the Bible. So here's our chance to prove that wrong by doing our own Bible study. I wouldn't accept any statement in class, if I was teaching, about what so-and-so says. Now, if it's some kind of expert testimony in terms of, I read this book by William Shea, and he says a Hebrew word means this or that, that's definitely allowable. Expert testimony is admissible in this court. In fact, give that person a gold star because it shows they've done some research and some thinking. But merely repeating someone else's ideas so you can avoid thinking is not cool. All right? We want to encourage people not just to come to the right conclusions, but to learn how to study for themselves and feed themselves. Now again, let me be very clear, not against our evangelists or our pastors or especially Ellen White. All right? But sometimes we can just use them as a crutch to say, well, of course this is true because so-and-so says it's true. But the question is whether the Bible says it's true, right? Did we go to the Bible and study this and come to this conclusion? Or did we honestly get this idea from somewhere else? If we are going to be Seventh-day Adventists who believe in sola scriptura, the Bible alone, then we have to go to the Bible alone when forming our doctrine. Now, other great Christian writers and speakers can definitely add to our understanding. They can help us express it in ways that maybe we can't do it ourselves. But the studying, the heavy lifting, should be something that we do either as a church family when we study together or privately at home. We want to encourage our members to think and to study for themselves. Okay, this is a tough topic, as I said, but an important one. So you don't have to be perfect. Just do your best. and keep pointing people to the point of all of this, which is to better know Jesus. On to Sunday. The first point on this day is that there is a pre-Advent judgment. That is, a judgment that takes place before the second coming of Jesus, before his advent. The lesson infers this from the fact that this first angel of Revelation 14 announces that the hour of his judgment has come. Now, I don't think this text in and of itself demonstrates a pre-Advent judgment. This first angel announces the judgment, two more angels share their message, and then we find the second coming, where judgment is indeed executed. One could read in Revelation 14 and conclude that the judgment the first angel is warning about is the judgment that comes at the second coming. The Son of Man will come, and with a sickle he'll harvest the earth, and that's what the first angel is warning about. The second coming is the execution of the judgment in Revelation 14. We don't have an explicit description of any pre-Advent judgment in Revelation 14. But it does stand the reason that if Jesus is coming back to destroy the beast and his followers, then some kind of pre-Advent judgment must have happened ahead of time. If the police show up to search your house in the United States, then you can safely assume that they had first gone to a judge with credible information that you had something illegal in your home, like too many cans of Big Franks. Now, there had to have been some kind of pre-search judgment on your property. Or if you get expelled from school, you can safely assume that there was some kind of pre-expelling judgment that school administrators had. Now, there must have been a pre-Advent judgment before Jesus comes with his rewards or his punishment. I think that's logical. It's the only way for us to have confidence that the judgment is just. So the pre-Advent judgment is not explicitly found in Revelation 14. I don't think that the first angel is describing in any way, shape, or form a pre-Advent judgment. He's just saying the hour of his judgment, meaning, I think, the second coming is near. But I do think a pre-Advent judgment is logically implied. Now, the lesson moves us to Daniel chapter 8, so let's read it together. And as usual, I'll be using the New English translation. He said to me, "To 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be put right again." Now, if you grew up with the King James Version like I did, then this sounds a little different. You notice that this translation says evenings and mornings and not days, like the King James says. This isn't a big deal. The Hebrew actually says erev boker, evening mornings. It harkens back to the creation story where the evening and the morning were the first day or second day or third day or whatever. The evening and the morning together comprise the Hebrew day. So this is 2,300 days. The other thing you might have noticed if you were raised in the King James Version is that the end of the verse says, well, sanctuary will be cleansed, but not in the New English translation. It says, then the sanctuary will be put right again. Now, Richard Davidson wrote a paper on this, which I've linked down below in the description. And he concludes that the Hebrew word here is too rich to be captured by any one English word. Yes, I know. It's that juicy. In fact, he identifies three different meanings here in Hebrew: to restore, to cleanse, and to vindicate. But you can't put three English words in there, so Davidson writes, if we were forced to choose a single English translation of nistak, probably the general basic meaning of made right or put right would be the most inclusive. And that happens to be what the NET uses. Just understand that it's a very rich word at work here. So Daniel says that after 2,300 days, the sanctuary would be put right, which includes the idea of cleansing. This doesn't mean that God was doing a spring cleaning of the sanctuary, but it is language bringing us back to the Israelite Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement was designed to ritually cleanse the sanctuary from the accumulated sins and impurities of the people throughout the year. So in Daniel 8:14, we have a Day of Atonement language going on here. The temple is not just being rebuilt, it's being cleansed of all sinful impurities. Now, what does all of this mean? Well, we don't know. The lesson tells us that at the end of Daniel 8, Daniel got sick again, just like he did in chapter 7, and he couldn't understand the vision of the 2,300 days. So we're left on a bit of a cliffhanger. Now in Daniel 9, Gabriel comes back to explain more of the vision to Daniel. So let's head on over to Monday. We've got a little bit more to talk about on Daniel 8 before we head to Daniel 9. Okay, Monday. To answer the first question there at the top of Monday's page, verse 19 indicates that the events of the vision Daniel was given in chapter 8 pertains to the appointed time of the end. Now, This doesn't by itself mean the end of all time. It could mean the end of their kingdom or the end of a particular era. But what is indisputable here is that the prophecy wasn't meant to apply to Daniel in his day. Verse 26 tells us that the 2300 days refers to a time many days from now. Now, before the lesson will let us get to Daniel 9, we have to talk about whether or not these are literal or figurative days. If they are 2,300 literal days, then we are talking about a little bit over 6 years. Does this apply to an ancient Seleucid king named Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, Antiochus indeed polluted the temple of God by sacrificing pigs and setting up an altar to Zeus, but his reign only lasted about 4 years after doing that, which is well short of the 6+ years of Daniel's prophecy. Antiochus is an intriguing and important figure in history, and I think Adventists have sometimes been too quick to dismiss his importance, but I don't find that he fits the bill here, at least not completely. Some Adventist scholars have seen Antiochus as maybe a local, partial fulfillment, but not the ultimate fulfillment of what Daniel is talking about. And I'll leave it there. This is a huge topic this week, and I have to pick and choose which subjects I'm going to dive a little bit deeper in, as you do when you teach this class. Now that brings us back to the question of whether these 2,300 days are literal 24-hour periods or whether they represent years. We should take the Bible literally unless it makes no sense to take it literally. And here, I believe it makes no sense to take it literally, as we'll find out when we get to Tuesday. So finally, let's get to Tuesday. On Tuesday, we're finally in Daniel chapter 9, where we will begin to tie all of this together. Daniel 9 takes place about 10 years after Daniel 8, so Daniel's been waiting a long time to understand the vision which started in chapter 7. Gabriel appears to Daniel again and tells him that he has finally come to give him the rest of the story. And while the objects in the vision change from Daniel 7 to Daniel 8 to Daniel 9, the subject itself doesn't change. In Daniel 7, it was about God's judgment on the beasts, which would vindicate his people and give them the kingdom. Daniel 8, it was about God's ability to cleanse the sanctuary from sin. In Daniel 9, where we talk about the coming Messiah, it is about putting an end to transgression and forgiving God's people. All three of these chapters attempt to get at the same basic point, that God has a plan in motion that will give his people victory, not just over their physical enemies, but over sin itself. Now, critics often point out that Daniel 9 has nothing, it seems, to do with Daniel 8 because the setting and the objects of the vision seem very different. But I think we're on firm ground here. As verse 23 points out, there's a continuity between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. We have a little horn in Daniel 7, which is also in Daniel 8. There are different points of continuity here, and the fact that Daniel ends chapter 7 and 8 by falling sick and isn't able to finish the vision shows us that we have unfinished business in these chapters. So what is Daniel 9, 24 to 27 all about? Okay, we're going to put these verses on the screen, starting with verse 24, and we're going to go through it slowly. Okay, first we're told that 70 weeks have been determined concerning your people and your holy city, with the goal of putting an end to rebellion, to bring sin to an end, to atone for iniquity, to bring in perpetual righteousness, and so on. Already I can tell you that no human being is going to accomplish those things. And again, sin is a sanctuary problem. As I said, the Day of Atonement was God's means of putting an end to sin each year in ancient Israel. So we are getting definite Day of Atonement vibes here. Verse 24 tells us that there are 70 weeks left to accomplish these things. And that's a pretty tall order if we're talking about literal weeks. 490 days, about a year and a third. The lesson wants us to understand two things here. First, that these are 490 years, not days. As usual, the lesson brings up Ezekiel 4:6, Numbers 14:34, and makes a rather strong statement that in Bible prophecy, one prophetic day equals one literal year. While I do think that sometimes we see a day for a year at work in the prophetic portions of the Bible, it is by no means a simple rule. Daniel 1, Daniel asks his guard to test him and his friends for 10 days. Should we assume that that means 10 years because Daniel's an apocalyptic book? No, of course not. Now, sometimes it works in reverse. Israel wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. In Matthew, we see Jesus wandering in the wilderness not for 40 years, but for 40 days. So that's more like a year for a day rather than a day for a year. The Bible plays with different ways to express time. So I don't take Ezekiel and Numbers to prove anything, except that sometimes time works that way in the Bible. There's no hard and fast rule here. There's no way to know in every single case whether this is a literal day or a day that represents a year. We just have to study the context and do the math. Now, I think a day equals a year in these passages because it just makes the most sense, as we will see. But before we get to our second point, let me make it clear that Adventists didn't invent this day for a year thing. As my friend David Hamstra has noted in a paper he wrote on these verses in Daniel 9, plenty of Jewish groups at the beginning of the first century understood the 490 days to be years, which pointed to their day. I'll also link that paper below if you're interested. There's a long tradition of understanding time in apocalyptic portions of the Bible this way. Okay, Matthew, what does all of this have to do with Daniel 9? And what does Daniel 9 really have to do with the 2300 days or years in Daniel 8? Good question. The second thing the lesson wants us to understand is the meaning of these 70 weeks. The translation I read says that these weeks have been determined, which is consistent across all translations, determined or decreed. In fact, few Bibles even have a footnote here suggesting that there's another way to translate this word. So why do Adventists want to see this word as translated cut off instead of determined? Because then it's clear that the 490 days are a period of time that has been cut off from a much larger period of time, namely the 2,300 days. Now, I think it's easy to link the 490 days with the 2,300 days because, as I said, these verses in chapter 9 are a further explanation and expansion of what Daniel was told in chapter 8. Gabriel has come to finish the job. But this word cut off or determined is a problem because this is a hapax legomenon, a word that is only found once in the Bible. So you can't compare it with how it's used in other verses. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, cannot speak with authority on this translation, but it goes without saying that only Seventh-day Adventists think this word should be translated as cut off. Look at what the lesson says. Gabriel tells Daniel that 490 years are cut off. The literal meaning of the Hebrew word chatak, sometimes translated determined. Now, this is disturbingly misleading. I checked almost every major English Bible translation from Wycliffe to the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, which was released in 2021. None of them translate this word as cut off. It isn't sometimes translated determined. It is always translated determined or decreed here. And what is this about the original meaning of the word? The old SDA Bible commentary says that this word occurs in post-biblical Hebrew with the meaning to cut. That post-biblical Hebrew is probably an allusion to the Jewish Mishnah, which was completed in the 2nd century CE, maybe some 700 years after Daniel wrote this chapter. Hey, words change meaning over time, and there's no guarantee that the meaning of an English word today can help us understand what it meant 700 years ago. But it might. Sometimes words do stay the same. Who knows for sure? Whenever major Adventist scholars write about this passage, you will always find qualified statements. Well, some this, and it may be this, and later on this. Now, does this mean we shouldn't defend the Adventist interpretation here? No, not at all. It makes the most sense to me. I just don't like it when the lesson makes it seem as if our interpretation is the most obvious one, when it isn't. I think we have a double meaning here. 70 weeks are decreed for your people. In other words, you have 490 years left. But also 70 weeks have been cut off for your people Israel. Cut off from what? Well, as Adventists would say, cut off from the longer 2300-year prophecy. I think both meanings make sense here, given that the purpose of this vision in Daniel 9 is to explain Daniel 8. And Gabriel clearly isn't explaining the meaning of the animals in Daniel 8. He's showing up talking about time prophecy. So I think we have good reasons to connect the dots here between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. Now hang in there with me because maybe you need to take a breath. Do that now. Get a drink of water. We're heading over to Wednesday. This is all going to make sense soon. On Wednesday, we move a little deeper into this prophecy in Daniel 9. Verse 25 tells us that from the issuing of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until an anointed one, a prince, arrives, there will be a period of 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Okay, so that's 69 weeks in total. There's a 7-week period, and then there's a 62-week period. That makes 69, there we go, out of 70. So this 70-week prophecy starts when a decree goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and it ends with an anointed one, a prince. This is another contested phrase among scholars, but as the lesson points out, the word Messiah does mean anointed one, and Jesus was also a prince of peace. So there are two roles described here, a spiritual role as a Messiah, also a royal role as a prince. Or if we want to put our preacher hat on and stretch the meaning a bit, we might see a hint at a being who would both embody the divine and human roles. Jesus was anointed of God, but born into a royal human family. Now, the problem is figuring out when this prophecy started. When did a decree go forth to restore and rebuild Jerusalem? Well, let's make things simple. There are actually several of these decrees in history, but the lesson helpfully only gives us one: 457 BCE, when Artaxerxes issued one such decree. And when you do the math, as the lesson guides you, and you travel 483 years, that's 69 weeks, right? If you travel those 483 years forward from 457 BC, you arrive at 27 CE, which is roughly when Jesus was baptized. What follows is the final week, the 70th week. It says in verse 27, he, meaning the Messiah, will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of that week, he will bring sacrifices and offerings to a halt. That is, Jesus began 7 years of ministry after his baptism, but in the middle of that week, after 3.5 years, he will bring sacrifices to a halt. Well, what does that mean? Verse 26 actually makes this clear. After the 7 and 62 weeks, I'm adding the 7 in there because it presumes that you remember that there were 7 weeks, then 62. An anointed one will be cut off and have nothing. In other words, 3.5 years after starting his work, after his baptism, of his work of bringing the covenant to the people, the Messiah will be cut off dead. And his death will be an end to all sacrifices. Now, this is why I just know these 70 weeks have to be years. This is why I don't quibble with 457 BCE as a starting date, because when you put the prophecy in place, it just makes sense. I don't see how it can be used any better way. Is this still a very complicated topic? Yes, absolutely. I'm sure you figured that out by now. Do I understand everything? Heavens no. But if you gave me a keychain with a bunch of keys on it and told me to open a door, I'm just going to keep trying all the keys, and one of them will work. I don't have to understand how the lock mechanism works. I don't have to understand what the other keys are for on the keychain, how they were made, or how you got them, or anything. All I have to know is that this one key unlocks a door. We could debate a lot of things here, but at the end of the day, this key works. I don't have to know exactly how it works, only that it does. And I don't really want to stand around talking about the lock. Now, Jesus came to bring an end to sin, to put an end to our sinful rebellion, to atone for iniquity, to confirm a new covenant, and so on, when those 70 weeks were up. All of that was accomplished in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. All right, on Thursday, let's talk about the 2300 years yet again. So we determined that the 490 years, which began in 457 BC, were cut off from the longer 2300 year prophecy. And how do we figure out this works? Well, because if the goal of this time prophecy, if the goal of the 70 weeks, I should say, the 490 years, is to get us to the time of the Messiah, then, well, we've seen that when we start at 457 BC and we travel forward 490 years, we arrive at the time of Jesus. We know when Jesus lived, so that checks out. And once we've got that locked into place, now we can look at these longer period of 2300 years. We have our starting date, which is 457 BC. So we add 2300 years from that to that. We go forward. Where do we end up? 1844 CE. That's when the sanctuary will be restored or cleansed or put right. Or as the lesson puts it, that's when this investigative judgment began. When God is in the final phase of getting rid of sin in the universe. He's going to return sometime after 1844, once he has decided on who has faith and I guess who lacks faith. Now, does God need 175 years to sort all that out? No, of course not. But neither did Jesus need to lay in the tomb for 3 days. God does things in his own time. I'm happy for Thursday because we get to talk about what all of this means. So celebrate yourself if you made it this far, because there is a fire hose of information that you've had to ingest to get to this point. Unfortunately, as people are less and less biblically literate in our churches, it gets harder and harder to explain all of this. So without understanding the basics of the Day of Atonement, for instance, it's hard for a lot of people to understand what any of this means. Why do we need an investigative judgment? Wasn't everything just finished at the cross? Jesus' death was absolutely crucial, super important. He was the Lamb of God, our Passover offering, but that's not the end of the story. Passover was the first of 7 biblical feasts in the ancient Jewish calendar. These feasts together represent God's process of getting rid of sin and restoring his people to holiness. After the 4 spring feasts, there would be a break before 3 autumn feasts, one of which was the Day of Atonement. So it makes sense to me, at least, that there would be a gap between the feasts which Jesus fulfilled in the first century and the final feasts which represent the completion of God's plan of salvation. It's enough to know that we are on our way home. Friday time. Let's summarize what we've talked about this week and how we can apply it. Now, that was a long journey, and at the end, can we honestly say that we understand the 3 angels of Revelation 14 better than when we started? I don't. But I think there is a theme here in both Daniel and Revelation that matches. As I said, the point of Daniel 7, 8, 9 is to reassure Daniel and the reader that God has things in control, even though it looks like the beasts and the little horns are running the show. They aren't. God is working behind the scenes to wrap this up. In Daniel 7, God does this through judgment. He indicts the beastly powers and the little horn and gives the kingdom to his people. That's good news to Daniel and his people who were in exile and wanted to go home. Daniel 8 explains a little more about the timeline of God's judgment. In Daniel 8:13, an angel asks, "How long does this vision of these beasts last? How long before it's over?" And the answer is 2,300 years. Now, Adventists would say that the investigative judgment started in 1844. It didn't end in 1844, but this final pre-Advent judgment is in progress, and when it ends, the beast will be defanged and God's people will possess the kingdom. What can we take from this study, however? Well, it reminds us that God is still on track with getting rid of the beastly powers in the world. When we get to Revelation 13 and 14, we see more beasts, and so I think there is a thematic connection there between Daniel and Revelation. God is reassuring his persecuted people in exile that he will finish his work and fulfill his promises of deliverance to his people. He will come back for us and take us home, no matter how bleak it looks outside. 2,300 years is a long time to wait. We've been waiting nearly 200 years now, even since that time. To put it another way, by the way, there's only 4 General Conference sessions left until we hit the 200th anniversary of 1844. Let that sink in. But this is why I believe one of the great values in Revelation is the patience of the saints. God is looking for people who can be patient and faithful. After all, hasn't he been faithful and patient with us? I also think that this topic reminds us of the times in which we live. If this is truly a time of heavenly judgment before Jesus comes, then we don't have time to mess around. It was common in the 3rd and 4th centuries for people to wait until they were older before getting baptized. The Roman Emperor Constantine actually waited till he was on his deathbed before getting baptized. So did Ambrose and Jerome and many more well-known figures of the early church. But when you're aware of the time in which you live and how short that time may be, why put it off? We have to prioritize Jesus today, not out of fear of the judgment, but because we're excited to go home. Now, I think understanding this stuff can also help deepen our trust in the Bible and in the fact that God is still working in history. If something happened in heaven in 1844, then that means we have confidence that God is still active in this world. He hasn't forgotten us. Now, what I like about this topic is the fusion of both legal and religious imagery. We have sanctuary imagery in Daniel 8 and 9, but also judicial imagery, that of judgment. These are but 2 metaphors, 2 ways of understanding what God is doing. He is cleansing the sanctuary of sin, but he is also judging sin and sinners. Both are the means by which we get justice in this world. Now, before I go, I wanted to let you know that I left you some links in the resources in the comments below. Nope, not comments, description below, that's it. Some of them are scholarly and deep for those who are into that. Others are just easier to read and grasp, and I especially wanted to highlight my friend Marcos Torres's free book called The Death and Rebirth of the Investigative Judgment. Now, he's not paying me to say that. He doesn't know I'm saying it, but you can head over to his website at the Story Church Project. The link is below, and you can get it for free. He's got a really easy, gospel-centered approach to this topic, and I've greatly appreciated his work both here and in the past. He connects, for instance, the cleansing of the temple in Daniel 8 with Jesus' cleansing of the temple in the Gospels. They're both examples of God making things right. And that's this time period that we live in as Christians. We should be in the world making things right. If God is cleansing the sanctuary up there, why are we not part of cleansing our own sanctuaries down here, the area around us in which we live, making things right with an urgency that we've never had before? So go check out Marcos's work. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you next week. Class dismissed.